Hi, welcome to the tutorial on neurosymbolic methods. My name is Chris Eliasmith, and I hold the Canada Research Chair in Theoretical Neuroscience at the University of Waterloo.
I'm Michael Furlong, a research scientist at the National Research Council of Canada.
Today, we'll be presenting techniques on symbolic manipulation using neural networks.
The problem we want to solve with these methods starts from the observation that humans are really good at reasoning, and that this reasoning often depends on their ability to manipulate symbols. That is, we want to use structured representations like those found in language and mathematics to perform this reasoning. And these structured representations allow people to extrapolate to unseen data in much better and more sophisticated ways than standard neural networks. In other words, we're better at generalization. Of course, we think both artificial and real neural networks manipulate vectors. So the question is, what is the difference between real brain-based networks and standard artificial networks, such that humans can perform reasoning and generalization really well, where standard artificial networks struggle? This relates directly to topics in week 2, day 5 of this course on high-level cognition. The methods that we're going to be looking at are ones that have been used to build large-scale models of biological cognition. You can see an example of such a model running here on the right. This is a model that we built in our lab called SPAUN, which stands for Semantic Pointer Architecture Unified Network, SPAUN. It performs all kinds of different tasks. It does structured reasoning, as well as standard things like classification, motor control, and so on. What we want to talk about today is how we got structured representations into a large-scale spiking brain model like SPAUN. Now, as I've already mentioned, we always think of neural networks as doing vector manipulations. Typically, we think of the results of those manipulations as appearing in the activities of the neural network, and the weights between the layers of the network are defining the computation. So the question really is, how can we use that standard way of thinking about neural networks to solve cognitive tasks? Now, of course, what cognitive tasks require is precisely structured representations. Representations like those I've already mentioned, including math and language. But the notion captures essentially all the standard data structures that you might find in computer science. So this includes things like lists and trees and so on. In addition, we want to think about perhaps more continuous representations, things like maps, which sometimes go beyond what we often think of in computer science. Beyond representation, we also need to manipulate those representations in order to perform the reasoning. That is, we need cognitive computations. So these will include things like composing different structured representations to create new ones, being able to do generalization based on structure, not just on content, and of course, transform structures in various ways. The approach we'll be taking in order to do this consists in adopting what is called a vector symbolic algebra, or VSA. VSAs may not be familiar to many of you, but essentially we're starting with the following hypothesis. In order to capture the kinds of structured representations required for cognitive tasks, like the ones I just mentioned, the brain manipulates high-dimensional vectors in a way that is captured by a set of algebraic operations. Of course, if you pick different operations, then you're picking a different VSA. So a good VSA will be one that supports the kind of cognitive operations that we see in people. Let's look at an example. Here's a task called the Wason card task. So you're confronted with 4 cards. On every card, there's a letter on one side of the card and a number on the other side. Now I'm going to give you an abstract rule about these cards, and your job is to determine which cards do you have to turn over in order to determine that the rule is true or not of these cards. Here's the rule. If there's a vowel on one side, then there has to be an even number on the other side. Remember, your challenge is to determine which cards you must turn over in order to verify this rule. So you can pause the video here for a moment, or maybe you've already figured it out. The answer is you need to turn over the A card. If there's an odd number on the back, then the rule has been violated. And you must also turn over the 3 card, because if there's a vowel on the other side of that card, the rule has also been violated. You don't need to turn over any other cards. This actually turns out to be a fairly challenging task for people. Regardless of how well people perform on this task, let's think about how we can represent this task in a way that's computable by neural networks, brains or otherwise. We can break the problem into 2 parts. One is to think about the concepts used and how they're represented, and the other is to think about how to represent or capture the relationships between those concepts. Beginning with the first, we can think of concepts or symbols that are used as being points on a high-dimensional hypersphere. This is a very standard way of thinking about concepts in neural networks. And of course, I can't draw a high-dimensional hypersphere, so I've drawn a 3-dimensional sphere. And we can think of symbols in this way by just labeling particular vectors. So maybe that is the even vector, and maybe this is the vowel vector. We'll think of those as being the latent state of a neural population. So this notion should be fairly familiar, and throughout most of the tutorial, we'll be generating those vectors randomly. Of course, in the brain, we don't think that the latent states are random. Instead, we think these symbols derive their meaning by being compressed from sensory or motor input, and by their relationship to other symbols. That is, the way in which they're used in a particular VSA statement. Now, this way of thinking about meaning and thinking about such vectors as being implemented in brain states is another story. And in fact, it's a long story. And so we have a name for these kinds of vectors because they're very central to the vector. We call them semantic pointers. Now, we're not going to be using this terminology today. Instead, we're just going to be talking about vectors. So once we've represented all of the concepts involved, of course, we need to represent the relationships. So we have to represent the structure. So for instance, if we consider that rule that we saw before, if there's a vowel on one side of the card, then there's an even number on the other side, we would classically capture it in something like this way. Vowel implies even. Now, of course, we don't know how to manipulate this using a neural network, right? We know how to write code in order to manipulate it. So the question is, how can we write this neurosymbolically? And here's a suggestion that comes from VSAs. We take all of the vectors that we identified using the previous methods, and we bind them using a binding operator, which is represented here as an asterisk surrounded by a circle. And then we bundle them, or collect them together, using another operator, here represented by a plus sign. In the particular VSA that we're going to be considering, the binding operator is circular convolution, and the bundling operator is addition. Now, the critical thing to notice about these two operators is that they act in really different ways. The plus sign, or superposition, essentially overlays vectors on top of one another, so the resulting vector is similar to both of the input vectors. But convolution intertwines the vectors, represented here by a rope, in such a way that the resulting vector, the bound vector, looks nothing like either of the inputs to that binding. This is an important observation that we'll come back to on several occasions. Now, we've got our representations. We've got both structure represented and we have concepts represented. But of course, we need to manipulate those representations in order to answer questions or do other kinds of transformations to the representations. So for instance, we might ask the question, what is the antecedent of that particular rule? So how would we compute that? Well, what we can do is take the inverse of the antecedent symbol, bind that with the rule representation, and then we can show algebraically that we should get the resulting vowel. Now, of course, vowel is the antecedent, and the consequent is even. So what does this look like algebraically? So you can see here I've written it out for us. And it's really just the way you would expect vector algebra to work. So if I bind an inverse with the original rule, and that would mean that the inverse cancels out the non-inverse of that, i.e. antecedent inverse cancels antecedent, and then you just have vowel. And of course, the inverse of antecedent is also bound with a bunch of other stuff, but the result is essentially noise. So it's a vector that we don't recognize because we haven't labeled it as a symbol. Now, when we have that vowel representation plus noise, we often want to get rid of the noise. So another critical part of computation using neurosymbolic methods like this is using something called a cleanup memory. You can think of this as a kind of denoising operator. And last but not least, we want to recognize the resulting vector as a particular labeled vector. So we can use a similarity operator to compare it to the set of vectors in our vocabulary to determine which one it actually is. So to this point, we've seen how to use neurosymbolic methods to capture a cognitive-like task, one that requires the manipulation of structure. So we saw how to represent concepts, how to represent the relationships between concepts, and then how to perform computations over those representations. We did all of these using a vector symbolic algebra. And that can be defined by 5 operations. In fact, throughout this tutorial, we're going to assume a particular vector symbolic algebra, one that is called holographic reduced representations, or HRRs. In this table, I've identified the general categories of operations that are required to define a vector symbolic algebra. In fact, there are many suggestions about what those operators can be for binding, bundling, similarity, and all of the above. But I've also identified the specific one that we're using on the right-hand side. As I introduced already, we have a similarity operator, in this case, just a dot product, which is used to determine when two concepts are the same or how similar they are. To do binding, we're using circular convolution. To do unbinding, we're also using circular convolution, but one of the symbols is inverted. To perform bundling, we're using superposition. And last but not least, we have cleanup, which is something that is defined slightly differently for semantic pointers than for HRs, but in any case, there's a wide variety of possible cleanup operations. And we'll return to each of these in more detail throughout the course of the tutorial. Now, something that we worry a lot more about when building models of biological cognition than we do if we're just thinking about vector symbolic algebras is implementation in the brain. That is, how are each of those operators actually captured by a microcircuit? Some of these operations are quite easy to understand as being embeddable in a neural network. So for instance, similarity is just multiplying the activities by the weights. Bundling is also quite easy because Kirchhoff's law essentially adds currents that flow into neurons. Binding is a little bit more complicated because it's something like circular convolution. Nevertheless, we can perform a Fourier transform, which is just a linear operation, and we can then multiply the activities in the Fourier space together to perform that binding. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Last, we've got unbinding, which, as I've already mentioned, is really just binding plus a permutation because our inverse is a permutation. And last but not least, we have cleanup. And there are many ways this can be accomplished. In the next two slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about binding and cleanup because they're critical and slightly more difficult to implement in a spiking neural network than the other operators. A key theme of this course is microcircuits. In fact, you dedicated all of week 2, day 1 to the topic. So we can ask the microcircuit question. That is, how might we build a binding microcircuit? Now, I'll admit that we have a technique in our back pocket that makes this a bit easier, and it's called the Neural Engineering Framework, or NEF. And this actually lets us analytically compute the weights for any computation, dynamic or otherwise. In this case, it's not a dynamic computation, it's just a feed-forward one. So we can write that down explicitly. In this instance, the convolution between two vectors a and b is equal to the inverse Fourier transform of the Fourier transform of a, element-wise multiplied by the Fourier transform of b. Now, because both the inverse and the Fourier transform are linear operators, they're pretty easy to embed in the weights. The challenge is really how do we multiply the activities once we're in the Fourier space. Because we have the NEF, we can write down an expression, this one I've shown here. And this tells us what the weight should be in order to effectively multiply the activities of a and b representations in the Fourier space to give us the binding that we want at the output. Now, without going into any details, I think it's instructive to see this in operation. So on the right-hand side here, we've got a neural circuit. And in fact, it's two binding circuits combined together. The first one on the top is going to bind the two inputs shown in the left in the boxes. And then the next binding microcircuit, it's going to do the inverse. It's going to do an unbinding. So to understand what these boxes are showing, they're essentially vectors. And then the similarity between the vectors that are being represented by those boxes and any other vector in the vocabulary is shown at the top. So in this instance, the top box is representing the red vector, and the bottom box is representing the square vector. And right now, the result of that isn't really similar to anything when we do the unbinding, right? So you see square written there, but it has a similarity that's equal to 0. So now when we run the circuit, we're showing those vectors in the latent space, but we can also see some spiking activity. And that just demonstrates that this is, in fact, a spiking neural network. And we can see that once we switch the unbinding input to red, which is happening right now, then the output becomes square. So this is basically saying I bound red and square, and then I want to unbind red, and the answer is going to be most similar to the vector for square. So we can see that this is performing, in fact, two binding operations, a binding and an unbinding, and it's doing this in a spiking neural network. This then shows a binding microcircuit. Now, similarly, we're also interested in cleanup memory. This turns out to be a little bit more complicated. It's a difficult computation to perform, and essentially it's a max function. But it's really important because it lets us recognize valid representation once we've done something like unbind them from a complicated structure. Ultimately, we can think of this as an associative memory because really what it's doing is essentially getting rid of the noise in a representation. So we're performing auto-association between a vector and a noisy version of that vector. If you're familiar with auto-associative memories, you'll know that there are, in fact, many different types of operations that perform this function. So you could just do a max function, that's a max over the similarity between the input noisy vector and all the vectors that are valid. Or we could stick the vector into a Hopfield network, which performs a mapping onto the most similar vector of the ones that are in the long-term memory of the Hopfield network. Or in fact, we can construct a feed-forward network explicitly using techniques like the ones we've seen on the previous slide. Let's look at what happens when we do that. Really, this is looking at the results of building such a microcircuit, and also noting that it scales extremely well. So in this particular instance, we're looking at about 60,000 terms or concepts. We're using a 500-dimensional vector for each concept. We're putting 8 pairs of concepts together, and you can think of these as slot filler pairs if you would like. And then we're going to be cleaning those up. And we've done this actually for many different dimensions and many different sizes of lexicon. That dashed line is the one that I was speaking about specifically. We can also map that entire circuit onto the cortex, and when we do that, it takes about 9 square millimeters of cortex. So this includes the binding, the unbinding, and the cleanup. And that's not really very much, and it's quite consistent with the kinds of connectivities that we find in mammalian cortex. This is also extremely fast, so it only takes about 10 milliseconds to give you an answer. And that's actually quite different from what you typically find in something like a Hopfield network, because Hopfield networks have a lot of recurrent connections. So this graph is summarizing the accuracy. It's essentially showing that for a particular number of dimensions, if you want a 99% accurate cleanup memory, so that means you get the right answer 99% of the time, and you've got about 60,000 concepts, that's what the dotted line is showing, which is the number of concepts in the average human vocabulary, then with a 300-dimensional vector, you can actually do an extremely good job, even for many different items in your structured representation. Ultimately, the last 2 slides that we've just looked at are really something that matter when we care about implementing these operations in spiking neural networks, and we want to make sure that they're biologically plausible. Throughout most of the tutorial, however, we're really going to be thinking about these representations in the latent vector space, and so we won't be talking a lot about implementation after this. Nevertheless, one of the things that I did emphasize on the previous slide is that this cleanup memory can scale really well. That is to the size of adult human vocabularies. And I think it's worth dwelling on this for a bit, because of course, if we have a neurosymbolic technique which can't scale to the size of a human vocabulary, then of course we've got a problem. And in fact, lots of the past techniques people have done for representing manipulation and structure representation in general actually run into these kinds of scaling problems. So using the VSA that we've introduced here, I want to show an example demonstrating that it does in fact scale really well. So here is an experiment. You can see the results of that. And what we did is take the concepts in WordNet. There are about 100,000 concepts in WordNet. And we used a representation similar to the one I was talking about on the previous slide, so 512 dimensional vectors. And then we encoded a lot of the relations that are captured by WordNet. You can think of a central relation as being like an is-a relation. So a dog is an animal, and an animal is a living thing is a kind of object, and so forth. So there's these relationships between dogs and living things and objects, and they're captured by those is-a relations. And that's captured in WordNet, and in WordNet you get about 13 levels of this kind of relationship, so you've got actually quite a big hierarchy. So the question is, if we encode all of that information into a spiking neural network, can we extract it? Can we extract it accurately? Can we put it into more complicated structures and still get that information out, and so on? And basically what this table is showing is that the answer to these questions is yes. The first experiment that we performed here is just decoding a particular concept. And you can see that you can perfectly decode any concept that you've stuck into such a hierarchy. In the second row, we're doing what we call hierarchy traversal. And in this instance, we're providing 2 inputs to the network and asking, are these 2 inputs related in some way by this is-a relation, let's say? And here you can see that about 95% of the time we can tell whether or not any 2 concepts are connected by an is-a relation, which is quite good since this is including up to 13 levels of distance in the hierarchy. And last but not least, we're saying, okay, can we take those same concept representations, encode them into more complicated structures, and then still perform those same kinds of processing tasks so we can recognize what all the concepts are? And again, the answer is yes. And I just want to give you a quick example of the kind of sentences that we're encoding things in. So for instance, here we can see an example sentence. The spider slowly knit the lamp the dog stole. And as you can see, these are randomly generated because we're really just taking verbs and adjectives, nouns, and so on, and combining them into something that's grammatically appropriate, but of course not necessarily semantically appropriate. But then we can see that using these VSA techniques, we can in fact extract all of the relevant representations, identify them within our cleanup memory with over 99% accuracy. So you might be wondering, how are we doing this? We only have 512 dimensions, there are over 100,000 concepts in WordNet, and we're not just encoding the concepts, but a bunch of relationships between them as well. So what exactly is going on here? And in short, this extremely good scaling comes from the fact that we're working in a very high dimensional vector space. And I love to repeat this little sentence that I've got here. High dimensional spaces are amazing places. What this means is that some of our intuitions tend to break down when we go into these high dimensional spaces. Sometimes this, in fact, turns out to be a good thing. For instance, in this case, when we're trying to pack a lot of information into a vector space, it actually works out pretty well. So let's consider a particular example to get an intuition for what I mean. So suppose we have a problem of trying to pack a bunch of vectors into a space. We put the constraint that they must be separated by a minimum of 10 degrees. And this is because they might be noisy. And we might want to be able to do cleanup. So any vectors near some other vectors should actually count as the same vector, and so on. Suppose we're in a two-dimensional space. And we're thinking about unit vectors here, so all the vectors lie on the unit circle. There are 360 degrees in a circle, so there are 36 vectors that we can pack into that two-dimensional space. If we add one dimension to the space, we suddenly get 413 vectors, a massive increase. And in fact, on the right-hand side, I've plotted how many vectors you can pack into vector spaces of the number of dimensions indicated along the bottom, while keeping them separated by 10 degrees. And as you can see, when you get to 8 dimensions, you have about 5 million vectors that you can pack in. Of course, we're working with vectors that have 512 dimensions. So the number of vectors you can put in there is astronomical. Instead, of course, of having them evenly spaced, we think that you might have a lot fewer vectors that you can pack in. Maybe we want them to be a lot farther apart. There might be a lot of structure in the way that things are packed in and so on. But I think this still gives you a good intuition for why this kind of approach can scale so well. So to this point, we have looked at an example of how we can construct a neurosymbolic representation in the case of the Wason card task. We saw how we can manipulate that representation using the same operators that we used to construct it. We then generalized our technique and noted that there are 5 operators that we can use to define a wide variety of representations. We then thought briefly about implementing that in the brain and thinking of it as biologically plausible. And finally, we stepped back to think about why these methods can scale so well. Now, I want to return to what it means to scale these methods in a large-scale model of biological cognition. Over 10 years ago, my lab built our first large-scale brain model, partly using these methods, which I introduced earlier and is called SPAWN. 6 years later, we built SPAWN 2.0. And that's what you're seeing here on the right. SPAWN 2 has 6.3 million neurons, 20 billion connections, and can perform 12 different tasks, including those listed here. Right now, on the right, you're seeing it do some simple visual recognition, memory, and motor control. It's seeing a digit, recognizing it, remembering it, and writing it out. Earlier, it was comparing 2 example images to see if they are the same, and writing a 1 if they're from the same class, and a 0 if they're not. The entire model is a large recurrent spiking neural network. We generally refer to it as the world's largest functional brain model. But it's likely one of the largest recurrent networks in general, since most neural networks with billions of parameters are feed-forward CNNs or LLMs. I should mention that we've used many methods in the construction of SPAWN. This includes deep learning, online learning, the neural engineering framework, as well as the VSA approach that we're focusing on here. Nevertheless, the model is best thought of as many individual spiking neurons connected to each other by time-varying synapses, each with a synaptic weight. Over the next few slides, I want to briefly describe SPAWN from an anatomical, physiological, and functional perspective, and then showcase some of its more impressive behaviors. This is a view of the complete model emphasizing the anatomical structures captured by the model. It includes a visual hierarchy labeled as V1 through AIT and circled in red. It has a working memory and executive control areas circled in green, motor control areas in purple, and the subcortical basal ganglia structures circled in orange, which are key to controlling information flow through cortex. All of the inter-area connections in the model exist in the mammalian brain, but of course the model is about 40 to 80,000 times smaller than the human brain from a neuron count perspective, so many connections are missing. Nevertheless, we capture 4 different kinds of neurotransmitters in SPAWN, and all communication is done using spikes that pass through those time-varying synapses, modeling the different neurotransmitters as appropriate. Interestingly, a large proportion of the neurons in the model are in the binding and unbinding networks that implement the VSA structures we've been talking about in this tutorial. So although there are no specific binding or unbinding areas, these computations do take significant resources in the model. Now, there are many models that incorporate the level of biological detail we have here, and there are also many that have much more detail. But one way in which SPAWN is unique is in the variety of tasks or functions it has integrated. This gives rise to another view of the model that emphasizes its functional organization, which you see here. Notice that in this view, you don't see components labeled by task names, but instead, you see the labels as being key information processing functions that are shared across many of the tasks. Beyond the visual inputs and motor outputs, there are components like working memory and action selection. Action selection coordinates information flow between all of the identified functional components to have the model perform its various tasks. The colors here represent their mapping to the anatomical areas on the previous slide. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that the model can perform any of the tasks in any order. You just tell it what to do by presenting visual inputs. One key aspect of how we've built this model is that it can be given the same inputs that you can give to a subject during an experiment. And it similarly produces observable motor actions to determine the behavior. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss all of the detailed results generated by the model. Actually, it might be a good point to mention that if you want, you can actually download and play with SPAWN. Just search for GitHub SPAWN 2.0 and you'll find it. Anyways, as I was saying, we don't have time for too many details, but suffice it to say that SPAWN does a good job of reproducing the kinds of single cell responses, both dynamic and spatial, that you see in real brains. It is also able to capture key high-level behavioral measures such as reaction times and error patterns. And importantly for our focus here, it can perform interesting cognitive tasks like taking a fluid intelligence test and scoring similarly to undergraduate students. To highlight the type of ability SPAWN gets from using VSA representations, let me show you a task I like to refer to as mental gymnastics. To explain what I mean, try following these instructions right now. So imagine a capital letter V and beside it a capital letter B. Rotate the B 90 degrees counterclockwise and place it on top of the V. If you erase the back of the B, what shape do you have? Doing this task requires you to follow instructions, generate internal representations, manipulate those representations, and then generate an answer by combining the results of those manipulations. This is the same kind of thing that SPAWN will be doing in this task. Specifically, it's performing 4 different subtasks, combining results from those tasks, and then generating an answer. In fact, we're having it show subanswers as well, but this isn't required. I should note that this is just one example. SPAWN can combine any of its tasks in myriad ways over several steps, which is why we call this task instruction following. And by the way, returning back to the instructions I gave before, the most common answer to those instructions is a heart or a 2-scoop ice cream cone. But now back to SPAWN. So let me talk you through what is happening as we watch SPAWN follow these instructions. First, it's shown P1, which means go through the instructions starting at the top. It begins by finding the pattern in the 2 examples where the count increases by 2, which it does. Then it answers a question by reporting what number is in the second position, and so it draws a 7. It then applies, i.e. adds, the pattern number 2 to the list numbers and writes a new list, 6, 9, and 4. Then it applies the pattern number to the position it was asked about, i.e. 2 plus 2, and writes a 4. As you can see from this example, SPAWN is able to use its VSA representations to remember and process structured internal representations. You may be interested to know that we just started working on the next version of SPAWN, which will give the model a body and allow it to navigate and interact with a 3D environment. So that concludes the introductory lecture for today's tutorial. In the remainder of the tutorial, you're going to be diving into these concepts in a lot more detail. So you'll be looking at the operators that we use to define the VSA that we use. You'll be using those operations in order to manipulate vectors. You'll be understanding how you can combine those operations in order to perform a simple cognitive task. We're going to start with SPAWN-like question answering. We're then going to turn to the Wason card task, but we'll also introduce learning in that task, answering the question, how can we build a system that actually learns to manipulate those kinds of inferential rules? Once we introduce learning, we can begin to touch on some other interesting topics like what kind of inductive bias have we imposed? Can that improve our sample efficiency when we're learning new tasks? Of course, this is one of the key reasons that we might care about structured representations. And if you're interested in learning more about using these representations, we'll introduce the notion of a continuous slot filler representation to build and query maps for object locations. I hope you enjoy the rest of the tutorial.